I've kept this to myself for years, but it's time someone knew what happened on Maple Street. What I'm about to recount isn't a story meant to entertain. It's a record of what was real, and it's something that still haunts me. I don't know if anyone will believe it, but every detail, every quiet moment, every uneasy feeling I had was true. It started small, with things that seemed like accidents, or maybe coincidences. By the time the pattern became clear, it was already too late for some of us. Maple Street used to look like any other quiet American neighborhood. The houses were neat, the lawns trimmed, the kids riding bikes in the late afternoon sun. But there was one house that everyone avoided. It was set back from the road, its paint peeling in long strips, windows dark and empty, the yard overgrown with weeds that tangled together like dark hair. Rumors about the house floated around the town for years. Some said it had been abandoned after a fire. Others whispered about the previous owner, a man named Ellis Grant, who had disappeared without a trace. No one went near it, and yet, from the first night I saw him, or rather from the first night I saw what he left behind, I understood that avoiding it wasn't enough. It began with the disappearances. A teenager named Lisa Carter vanished one rainy evening, her bike left upturned on the curb in front of her house. The police combed the surrounding area, questioned neighbors, and eventually chalked it up to a runaway case, though everyone who knew her knew she would never leave willingly. Then came Michael Hughes, a young man in his 20s who had been seen walking home from the convenience store. His truck was found at the edge of the woods behind Maple Street, engine still warm, doors unlocked, but Michael was nowhere to be found. People started locking their doors at night, watching the shadows of trees crawl across the street with suspicion, whispering to one another about patterns that didn't yet make sense. I was working at the diner when the third disappearance happened. I remember the morning clearly, the way the waitress's hands shook as she poured coffee, the way the regulars, normally talkative, sat in silence. Her name was Sarah Whitman. She hadn't come home after her evening shift. Police cars lined the street outside her apartment, yellow tape cutting off the sidewalk, neighbors craning their necks to see what had happened. By then, it was impossible to ignore the pattern. Something was happening on Maple Street, and everyone was afraid to confront it. That night, I walked past the abandoned house for the first time. The streetlights were dim, flickering occasionally, and the air had a damp, heavy smell, like rotting leaves mixed with wet concrete. I didn't go inside, no one ever did, but the front door was slightly ajar, a subtle shift in the shadows behind it. I felt something watching, something deliberate, waiting. The feeling wasn't immediate terror, it was slower, deeper, a kind of prickling dread that crept up your spine and settled there. I didn't know it at the time, but standing there, I had already begun walking the edge of something I couldn't leave behind, something that would consume months of my life. Over the next few weeks, the town's fear grew. People started checking on one another, offering rides to work or school, but even that didn't stop the vanishings. It became impossible to distinguish caution from paranoia. I started keeping a journal of every suspicious sighting, every strange noise in the night, every report that came from the police scanner I had hidden in my apartment. I wasn't the only one documenting, but most people didn't share their observations. They whispered them, shared them with friends, neighbors, anyone who wouldn't judge them for being afraid. The house loomed over every conversation, every glance down the street, every late-night walk. No one could prove it, but everyone knew the pattern pointed there. One evening, drawn by a mix of fear and something I can only describe now as compulsion, I decided to get closer. The wind had picked up, rattling the loose shutters, carrying the scent of decay in sharp, biting waves. I moved along the edge of the property, careful not to make a sound. Inside, the darkness was almost tangible, pressing against the windows in thick black sheets. I didn't see anyone, but I noticed something chilling, signs of recent activity, a boot print in the dirt, fresh scratches on the wooden door frame, a faint outline where something heavy had been dragged across the floorboards. It was subtle, easy to miss, but in that moment, I understood that the house wasn't just abandoned, it was active. Someone had been there, and they weren't leaving. I left that night shaken, but unable to stop myself from thinking about what I had seen. I walked home under the streetlights, heart hammering. Every sound amplified: the wind through the trees, the occasional car, the distant bark of a dog. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, it was filled with dreams of locked doors and shadowed hallways, whispers just beyond comprehension, and the faces of the missing staring out at me with silent accusations. I couldn't tell anyone exactly what I had seen, not yet. It was too early, too dangerous. And yet I knew, as surely as I knew the sky would rise with the morning, that the answers to these disappearances were in that house. I just didn't know what I was willing or able to risk to uncover them. The days that followed were a blur of tension. New reports came in, people moved away, the police presence increased, but none of it offered answers. I began noticing subtle changes in the town itself, curtains drawn tight during the day, locked gates where they hadn't been before, neighbors whispering across fences rather than speaking directly. The fear wasn't just about what had happened, it was about what might happen next, and the invisible weight pressing down from that empty, rotting house at the end of the street. It had become a fixture of dread, an unspoken presence that everyone pretended wasn't there, but could not ignore. By the time I realized I could no longer walk past without staring, without feeling the pull of some invisible force, I was already too far in. I had crossed line, though I didn't yet know the full extent of it, and the journey into that darkness was only just beginning. The first time I went inside the house, I told myself it was only to prove that nothing was there. That's what I repeated in my head as I stood on the sagging porch a week after I'd noticed the fresh boot print. The police had searched the property briefly after Michael disappeared, but they hadn't found anything substantial. They said it was structurally unsafe, that the floorboards were unstable, and the roof was caving in at the back. What they didn't say, what everyone knew, was that they didn't want to stir up panic by turning an abandoned house into the center of an official investigation without evidence. I stood there long enough for doubt to settle in, long enough for the wind to shift and brush against my neck like cold breath, and then I pushed the door open. The smell hit me first. It wasn't the smell of rot like I'd expected. It was cleaner than that, almost chemical, like old detergent layered over damp wood. The floor creaked under my weight, and I moved carefully, keeping close to the walls where the boards felt more solid. The living room was stripped bare, except for a collapsed sofa and a few overturned boxes. Dust lay thick on most surfaces, but not evenly. There were disturbances lines through the dust, as if something had been dragged, small patches wiped clean by a sleeve or a hand. I felt my pulse in my throat as I moved deeper into the house. The kitchen showed clearer signs of life. A single plastic water bottle sat on the counter, half full. It wasn't new, but it wasn't years old either. The label hadn't faded. In the sink there were faint rust stains, but no dishes. I opened a cabinet and found it empty except for a roll of duct tape and a pair of latex gloves. I remember staring at the gloves for too long, my mind trying to frame them as innocent. Maybe construction workers had left them, but something in my chest tightened, a warning that didn't need words. I didn't touch anything. I backed away slowly and told myself I would call the police. But I didn't. That's the part that's hardest to admit. I told myself they wouldn't take it seriously, that they'd ask why I was trespassing. I convinced myself I needed more proof, something undeniable. So instead of calling, I started watching. I began parking my car 2 streets over and walking past the house at different times of night. I kept my lights off in my apartment and sat by the window facing Maple Street with a pair of old binoculars I'd found in my closet. Most nights, nothing happened. The house remained still, the windows blank, the door unmoving. And then, 3 nights after I went inside, I saw a light. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first, a thin glow from what must have been the back room, flickering briefly and then disappearing. I held my breath, convinced I'd imagined it. A few minutes later, it returned, brighter this time, like a flashlight beam sweeping across a wall. My hands were shaking so badly I had to set the binoculars down. Someone was in there, someone who didn't want to be seen. The next morning, I called Detective Ramirez, who had been assigned to the disappearances. I didn't tell him everything. I said I'd noticed unusual activity in the house, that I thought it deserved another look. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before he responded, his voice tired but measured. "You're not the first person to say that," he told me, "but we need more than suspicion." I described the light. I mentioned the water bottle and gloves. He didn't dismiss me outright, but I could hear skepticism in his tone. He said they would swing by. They did. 2 officers entered the house that afternoon while I watched from across the street. They were inside for less than 20 minutes. When they came out, their expressions were neutral. Ramirez knocked on my door later that evening and told me they'd found nothing significant. The house was empty. No signs of forced entry, no recent occupation. The water bottle and gloves were gone. I felt something cold settle in my stomach as he spoke. I hadn't imagined them. I knew I hadn't, but there was no way to prove it. Ramirez studied my face carefully before he left, as if weighing whether I was a concerned citizen or something else entirely. That was the first time I realized suspicion could turn in any direction. After that, the tension in town escalated. A 4th person disappeared, a middle-aged man named Thomas Avery, who had been walking his dog near the wooded trail that connected to Maple Street. The dog returned home alone, leash dragging behind it. That detail spread faster than anything else. It wasn't just tragic, it was intimate. The image of that animal coming back without its owner lodged itself into everyone's mind. Town meetings were held at the community center. Voices rose, accusations flew, and the house on Maple Street became the focal point of every argument. Some demanded it be demolished. Others said that would only destroy potential evidence. I sat in the back of the room during those meetings, saying little, watching faces. I noticed who avoided eye contact when the house was mentioned, who shifted uncomfortably, who seemed too calm. Paranoia became a shared language. Neighbors who had known each other for decades began questioning one another's routines, their alibis. I started seeing things that may not have been there, shadows lingering too long. A car parked down the block with its engine running, footsteps behind me when I walked home at night. I began carrying a small pocket knife in my jacket, though I doubted it would make a difference. Sleep became shallow and fragmented. Sometimes I thought I heard movement outside my window, the soft crunch of gravel, but whenever I looked, there was nothing. Then one night, I saw him. It was close to 2 a.m. when I noticed a figure stepping out of the side door of the house. He moved carefully, deliberately, like someone who had practiced not being seen. He wasn't tall or imposing. He looked ordinary. That was the worst part. He wore a dark hoodie and jeans, his face partially obscured by the hood, but I caught a glimpse of his profile under the streetlight, a sharp jawline, light stubble, eyes scanning the street with quick, controlled movements. He locked the side door behind him and walked toward the wooded trail without hesitation. I followed. I don't know why. Maybe I thought this was the proof I needed. Maybe I believed I could track him, learn where he went. I kept my distance, heart pounding so loudly I was certain he could hear it. He moved through the trees with familiarity, weaving between trunks without slowing. The deeper we went, the darker it became. I lost sight of him once, panic surging, but then I heard something, a low metallic clang, like a gate closing. I crouched behind a tree and waited. Minutes passed. Then I heard it again, followed by a sound that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. A muffled voice. Not loud enough to make out words, but unmistakably human. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was someone trying to speak through something. My throat went dry. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure reemerged shortly after, alone. He adjusted his sleeves, looked around once more, and retraced his steps toward Maple Street. I stayed hidden until I was sure he was gone. When I finally moved forward, I found what he had concealed. A narrow opening in the ground, covered by a sheet of rusted metal partially buried under leaves. It led down into darkness. I didn't go any closer than the edge. The air rising from it was stale and cold. I stood there, frozen, knowing that whatever was below was real and alive. And for the first time, I understood that the disappearances weren't random. They were deliberate, planned. And someone in our town was responsible. I didn't call the police that night. I've asked myself that question more times than I can count, and the answer is never simple. Fear played a part, but it wasn't just fear of the man I had followed. It was fear of being wrong, of sounding unstable, of becoming the town's next suspicion. I went home just before dawn, my clothes damp from the brush, hands trembling so badly I had to sit on the edge of my bed for nearly an hour before I could think clearly. Every sound outside my apartment felt amplified. When a car passed, I flinched. When someone shut a door down the hall, my chest tightened. I kept seeing the rusted metal sheet in my mind, the narrow black opening beneath it, and hearing that muffled voice. I knew what I'd heard. By mid-morning, exhaustion gave way to urgency. I drove back to the trail in broad daylight, telling myself that everything would look different under the sun. The woods felt smaller, less ominous, but the opening was still there, disguised carefully but not well enough to hide from someone who knew what to look for. The metal sheet had been repositioned slightly. That detail unnerved me more than anything else. Someone had been there since I left. I knelt down and pressed my ear toward the gap without fully uncovering it. At first there was nothing. Then, faintly, I heard movement. A dull scrape, a shift of weight. My pulse roared in my ears. I whispered, "Hello?" before I could stop myself. The woods swallowed the word. A second later, I heard a sharp knock from below 3 quick strikes against something solid. It wasn't random. It was a response. That was when I finally called Detective Ramirez. My voice didn't sound like mine when he answered. I told him everything this time. The light, the man, the trail, the sound. There was a long silence on the line before he said, "Stay where you are." His tone had changed. It wasn't skeptical anymore. It was tight, focused. Within 20 minutes, 2 patrol cars pulled up near the edge of the woods, lights off. Ramirez stepped out first, his expression unreadable. I led them to the opening. One of the officers used a crowbar to lift the metal sheet fully. The smell that escaped was unmistakable damp earth, sweat, something sour and human. They shone flashlights down and revealed a narrow set of makeshift wooden steps descending into what looked like a reinforced cellar dug beneath the tree line. Ramirez didn't hesitate. He drew his weapon and started down. What they found below was not supernatural. It was worse. The space had been carved into the earth and supported by beams stolen from somewhere else. There were chains bolted into the wall, a mattress stained dark in places, empty food containers, a portable lantern, and in the far corner, Thomas Avery. He was alive, but barely. His wrists were raw where they'd been restrained. His eyes blinked against the sudden light as if he didn't trust what he was seeing. When Ramirez reached him, Thomas tried to speak but could only produce a hoarse whisper. He had been there for 3 days. He said there had been others before him. He said the man kept them separated, moved them, threatened them. He said he made them listen to one another through the walls. Backup arrived quickly after that. The woods filled with officers, paramedics, yellow tape. The man I had followed was arrested that afternoon as he attempted to enter the house on Maple Street. His name was Daniel Harlow, 34 years old, born and raised in the town. He worked part-time at a hardware store 2 blocks from the diner where I worked. I had seen him dozens of times and never registered him as anything more than background. That realization settled heavily in my chest. Ordinary had been the mask all along. The investigation that followed unraveled layers no one had expected. The house on Maple Street had been in Daniel's family for years, technically abandoned but still legally owned. He had keys, he had access. The basement of the house showed signs of temporary holding areas that had been cleaned thoroughly. Forensic teams found trace evidence fibers, faint blood traces invisible to the naked eye. The water bottle and gloves I had seen were part of a system. He wore gloves constantly inside, wiped surfaces, rotated locations. The underground cellar wasn't the only one. 2 more were discovered within a mile radius, each hidden carefully beneath brush and scrap metal. Lisa Carter's remains were found in the second site, Michael Hughes in the third. Sarah Whitman was discovered buried behind the Maple Street property line. There was no ritual, no cult, no grand explanation beyond what Daniel eventually admitted under interrogation. He liked control. He liked watching fear build in the town. He followed the meetings online. He listened to the rumors and felt powerful knowing he was the source. The trial lasted nearly a year. I testified about what I had seen, about the light in the window, about the figure moving through the trees. Sitting in the courtroom, I forced myself to look at him when he entered. He didn't look monstrous. He looked tired, detached. At one point, his eyes met mine, and there was no rage there, no remorse either. Just recognition, as if we shared a secret that only we understood. That look followed me home that day and stayed with me for months. The town never fully recovered. Even after Daniel was sentenced to multiple life terms, Maple Street didn't feel the same. The house was demolished eventually, but the empty lot seemed worse somehow. A reminder of what had been there. People moved away quietly. Others stayed, but stopped attending community events. The diner lost its morning crowd. Conversations remained cautious. It's difficult to explain how something like that reshapes a place. It doesn't just take people. It takes the sense of safety that holds a community together. As for me, I still think about the nights I sat by my window watching that house. I think about how close I came to ignoring what I saw. I think about the fact that Thomas survived because I decided to follow a man into the woods instead of looking away. That knowledge is heavy. It's also fragile, because sometimes when the wind moves through the trees behind my apartment, I hear a faint echo in it, a dull knock carried in memory, and I wonder how many signs we miss every day because they seem too small, too uncertain, too inconvenient to confront. I don't tell this story to frighten anyone. I tell it because evil doesn't announce itself. It lives quietly in ordinary houses behind familiar faces, waiting for someone to notice the details. And if you ever do notice them, I hope you won't wait as long as I did.